Hello and welcome to Walk the Talk. I'm Shekhar Gupta in its surprisingly clear afternoon. And my guest today, Akim Steiner, head of UNDP. Welcome to Delhi. We organize this weather for you. We organize this dream. We don't want you to come to Delhi and go back with such a bad impression of our time.
Well, thankfully it's not my first time here, but today certainly is a beautiful day.
And the reason I start with climate and not with development is that we spent a full 10 years running United Nations Environment. The top of the mind issue for us, or the water cooler issue as we call it, or the trending issue, the quality of our air. Do you have a view?
I think the world has already shown that there are plenty of solutions to the challenge of pollution. No country has completely eliminated pollution, but the price we pay today, what the World Health Organization tells us every year, that over 7 million people die prematurely and over 4.5 million as a result of air quality issues, clearly shows that there is still a major problem. But in many parts of the world, the cleaning up is happening. It is partly because regulations are put in place, timelines are put in place, and also new technologies come into the market. New mobility concepts are there, renewable energy technology, a change in land use and land use management. I mean, the factors that drive pollution in cities in Asia, South Asia, Latin America and North America are different, but they are, at the end of the day, manageable because we choose to tackle them. And if we don't tackle them, then yes, there are many arguments that are used, it's too expensive or it's not a priority. But too many people are suffering, and that's why I think wherever you turn in the world, people are asking questions of their government, including in those parts of the world where pollution may not be as visible and as immediately impacting you, but it's still there. Pollution is also a sign of asking society to pay a price that some will pay more than others. Remember, in the industrialized world, very often the wealthy lived upstream of the factories because the wind would push pollution downstream. So it's a mixture of rapid growth, not deploying the technology.
In India, the rich have moved to Goa.
Well, that may be the case, but I think many also in New Delhi now would consider themselves to be wealthy sufferers of pollution. So I think it's an issue where the population and the government are in a compact with one another. And that compact needs to be renewed. And clearly, in many parts of the world, pollution has become unacceptably high. And yet also people are saying it's not the inevitable price for development.
So speak from your experience of 10 years. How amenable did you find government when you raised this issue?
Increasingly amenable, where basically politics felt the pressure of the street. When people are no longer willing to accept this, governments begin to act. And this is across the world, whether you look to China, whether you look to the United States, whether you look to Europe. Even now in Europe we are discussing in the country that is, in a sense, the center of modern automobile construction and industry, the big debate about diesel engines. And what is interesting is that in Germany, just in the last 2 years, the discussion has moved from, electric mobility maybe next century, to actually maybe producing the last of the combustion engine somewhere around 2030, because the world is moving to an entirely new technology platform. That's how quickly things can change.
And they are changing.
And they are changing, absolutely.
So, I'm interested in what you said just now. You said politicians, the governments respond to the pressure of the street. Do you get the sense that we are doing enough on the street in India?
Well, look, every newspaper I would open today in India, every magazine...
As an air purifier ad.
Well, there is always a commercial success story to every problem, but the public debate is very much alive. I think governments, local governments, mayors are seized by it. Industry is also feeling the pressure because industry and manufacturing must be part of the solution. The question is, governments have a key role to play to orchestrate an accelerated response, and I think this is partly where there has to be a consensus that essentially makes it possible for captains of industry, local government, national, federal government to come together and say, this is the plan for moving us to the next stage. And I think it has already begun in India.
Do you have a list of 3 or 4 or 5 things? You know the climate of India, you know the problem. Things that India could do on priority.
set clear targets. If you don't set targets, you don't create accountability. So
air quality targets?
Air quality, emission, pollution levels that have to go to the source. See, we try to manage pollution too often at the tail end. Where we have to go is at the source of pollution, whether it's in air, in water, in soil. If you go to where that pollution is created, you have a much cheaper option for actually reducing it also. So set targets at the source of pollution. Secondly, timelines for which it is met. Secondly, identify the technology opportunities that are available and create the kind of public policy that creates incentives, tax breaks and so on to accelerate the deployment of technology. And thirdly, start working with the users of the services that ultimately drive this pollution, like mobility. Can a city such as New Delhi, Mumbai, Berlin or Beijing move to a completely different set of transport and mobility systems where we maybe need 1/5 of the vehicles in the future to transport as many people as quickly and conveniently as others?
But we have other issues also. For example, I don't know, you must have heard of the problem of stubble burning. Absolutely. North of India and Pakistan, because winds don't follow any border control. So dust storms arrive from Saudi Arabia, then Pakistan is stubble burning at that time, that gets added, then we burn our stubble, that gets added, and that's then doing to air quality, not just in Delhi, just in all over North India. Varanasi, our Prime Minister's constituency, is usually much worse than this.
You know, as so often in this particular instance, stubble burning is a cheap option for farmers to basically deal with what's left over after harvest. So if the problem now becomes so significant, then the obvious thing is to go back and ask what would make farmers stop doing this. Is it just a law that prohibits it? Maybe that is different in the short term. Are there incentives we can offer them? Because it is also a matter of helping a poor economic enterprise to deliver a service that has a public good and a common good. So there are different approaches to this, that government has both the legislative power and the executive authority to implement. And I think that way you go up each supply chain of pollution and find solutions. It may be that the solution may also be in a form of land use that can be encouraged with extension services. The solutions are multiple, but they will not happen if the incentives are not in place to act. And sometimes there may be hard regulation. More often, the more intelligent one is, how do I make somebody do something differently, because it's also in their interest.
So do bureaucracies in countries like ours ask you the right questions? I'm still holding you in your previous job. We haven't come to the current one. Or do they duck the key questions?
What bureaucracies in countries we work with as the United Nations do not welcome is postulating and proselytizing. So I think a UN program, be it the environment program, the development program, is not needed in India in the year 2017 to say we have a problem with pollution. The question is, what are practical solutions? What can we learn from others? What kind of partnership can you develop with us to make it happen?
What kind of help can you bring?
Well, first of all, we can bring the lessons that have been learned by other countries. I mean, we are engaged in 170 countries. We have learned in Europe what kind of pollution measures work. For instance, in terms of EU standards for vehicle emissions, we have looked at Chinese cities and the policies that have led to a significant reduction in pollution levels by bringing other energy forms in. We also look at market mechanisms that create the incentives, for instance, for farmers to practice different land uses. That experience is one that can be a shortcut for India to look at and then say, well, this is a menu of options that we can translate here. Just like India did, for instance, when it came to Brazil and President Lula's social policies of leaving no one behind in Brazil, India in part studied that and then combined it with its own technology platform and universe to take these kind of policies into the digital economy age. That's how development happens, with ideas coming together.
Technology platform, you mean Aadhaar?
Yes, for instance, the whole biometric platform, which in turn is a remarkable development story unfolding in India, which many governments in the rest of the world are interested in. So again, by UNDP being a partner to India in its own national development thinking, we also have the ability, together with India, and in terms of our work, to share some of these lessons with other governments who are looking at e-government platforms as a way of doing business.
UNEP just made big news in India, big headlines. unfortunately, after you've grown out of it, because they gave a fixed certificate to one of our little towns in Kerala, a town of what used to be called Alapura, for its waste management, now being
I read about it.
set as an example for the rest of the world. Are you familiar with it? Do you know
Not
how
so
the
familiar.
town got rated like that? And how do you do these ratings and how useful are they?
Basically, what we often do in the United Nations, for instance, in UNEP, you have the Champions of the Earth program, is we look for stories of people or institutions that went against the grain of what is accepted wisdom. You know, very often economics is invoked, technology is invoked. Oh, you can't ask poor people to do something like this, and we like to profile people who actually prove that the impossible is possible.
Human development, we are still struggling, I just heard here about. First of all, do you think this is fair, these ratings? And second, what can India do to
Let me first of all say that every rating is an approximation of reality. So if somebody wants to challenge the ratings on the detail, I think they will always find a reason to question. Well, that is your word, but by analogy. I think what the Human Development Report did over a decade and a half, 2 decades ago, is to first of all challenge the notion that progress and success in development is defined by GDP and economic growth alone. That was its big contribution. In then trying to make it more relevant, it was also asked to apply a lens on national performance. And here, I can assure you that with every year that UNDP launches its report, there is a good group of countries that feel extremely upset, and another group of countries that in the year before were very upset are now extremely happy because they have changed rankings. I don't want to overrate the rankings, but let me be honest and frank. The attention that the ratings get are in some ways the proof that they're actually worth having, because governments, for many reasons, just like we as individual human beings, we pay attention to how we are performing. And you know, India's position in these ratings and rankings, I don't even wish to judge in terms of its accuracy as it would be viewed from the government perspective. The fact of the matter is that in developmental terms, India, by its own statistical and policy and public debate, would not negate the challenges that are in part reflected also in the rankings. This Prime Minister has made it a priority of his administration, of his government, to address some of these issues. So I think let's get less upset about the fact that there is an index out there that seems to indicate challenges.
I'm just upset that we have such poor rankings. I'm not saying these are unfair. I just wish that our country had better.
But there are only two solutions to that. One is to improve India's own development performance, or to expect the others to come down. And I hope it's the former rather than the latter.
Well, I don't think others will listen to us on the downside.
Yeah. But let me say also, I mean, India has also challenges on a scale that are often not comparable to other nations. And I, for one, believe that in India we see an enormous will and commitment in a long tradition already of a socially minded historical approach to development, its constitution, but also now a new attempt at accelerated economic growth, but not at the expense of addressing poverty and inequality.
Well,
that's
also
critical.
Also, I think a sanitation program is critical, because sanitation program is not just about living cleanly, but also about health. Because a lot of our health issues are very good. Some over the
just a few weeks ago, we celebrated World Toilet Day, and outside the United Nations in New York on First Avenue was a giant blown-up white toilet seat. And some people said, how can you put something like this in front of the United Nations? This is not appropriate. I would argue, absolutely, because the amount of conversation that toilet seat caused in front of the United Nations, maybe of people who would never have anything to do with the United Nations, just to learn why do we actually have a World Toilet Day, is because there are literally hundreds of millions of people who do not have the privilege, the luxury, or just the basic facilities in terms of their public hygiene. I think this is something that we in the United Nations have an obligation to both draw attention to and then provide support to countries to address this.
So has UNDP carried out any assessment of India? Toilet program or
that I'm not aware of, but I would assume as part of the work that we do with the UN country system, and looking at water and sanitation issues, I'm sure that these are analyses that form part of the advice that we also offer to the government.
So, Ahim, you are a true UN citizen.
That's a kind thing to say.
I think genetically as well as in terms of the time you spent around the world. You are a Brazilian German, educated in Britain, and how many languages do you speak?
4.5, let's say, yeah.
It's half Tamil?
No, the Tamil not. No, I learned a little bit of Tamil, but it was so long ago that I was not...
So you came and spent a year here in Tamil Nadu?
Indeed. I often describe it as my apprenticeship year after I graduated from university. I was very fortunate to study under a true Ghanaian development leader in Tamil Nadu in a small village near Trichy.
And how did you get there? How does a student from Europe get there?
It was a small network of volunteers who organized amongst themselves these programs that would allow you to spend a year in an organization, not to advise but to learn. And the cohort that would return would select those who would go the next year. It was self-financed, so we raised our own funding. And it was the best investment I think I ever made in my life because it changed my outlook on development.
So your experience from other countries, I believe you had quite a fruitful stint in Kenya.
A tremendous time. I felt very privileged to be heading a United Nations organization working from within Africa, because I believe, contrary to those who thought that when UNEP was established in Nairobi, and actually it nearly could have been also in New Delhi, because India at the time was also a candidate, thought that UNEP was not in the central crossroads of the world. I believe that the way that UNEP has, over the years it has existed, addressed environment and development issues is in part a product of having been born on the African continent and having had to justify its thinking about sustainability in the context of poverty eradication, the aspiration for economic progress. And my own experience of living in Kenya is nothing but a beautiful one. I mean, it is a country generous in spirit, beautiful geographically, and at the heart of Africa.
India passed this remarkable treaty law.
They did quite a number.
How much, to what extent do laws work? Because in our country, in my cynical moments, which are most of my moments, I call it lollipop politics. L-A-W-L-I-P-O-P. Whenever there is a problem, our government passes a law. So we can pass a law against bad weather, against losing in cricket. We haven't yet done so, but we might. Right. So we have a law for minimum wages. We have a law for guaranteed employment. We have a law for food. We have a law for education. We have legal guarantees for everything. Nothing works in real life.
Well, let me just remind you that you have, first of all, in the absence of any laws, no rights. So in the absence of having legislation, you don't even have the possibility to demand the respect of my right as an individual. I think it is no accident that in India the justice system is a very key part of India's governance system, and perhaps it is also no accident that quite a number of times development projects end up in court. So there is a contest about what is the price that society is willing to pay for a particular, industrial investment or infrastructure project. Having said that, laws ultimately are meaningful when they are adhered to, they are enforced, and therefore they are defining in terms of the conduct of government or citizens or the private sector. But laws can also send signals and be enabling laws. In smart legislation today, it's not always about prohibiting something, it's actually about enabling something, signaling to the market that the future lies here and not there. And in Kenya, the example you mentioned, which was a renewable energy legislation, it transformed Kenya's electricity infrastructure development path. Kenya is today a country that is both building the largest wind power farm on the African continent. It is the country that is among the leaders globally in tapping geothermal power.
Any advice for a country like India? Large economy, large energy needs, unmet energy needs. It's doing a lot in renewables, but still very heavily committed to coal.
I don't profess to have an answer of how one can make this rapid transition into a low-carbon economy without significant choices that need to be made in a national context. What I have learned, however, in the last 15 years of watching the renewable energy economy emerge around the world is that those who argue that it cannot be done rarely do so out of knowledge, but more out of prejudice or vested interest. And that is very important for the public to understand. Because what energy technology choices we make as a nation, be it India or be it Brazil or Botswana or Germany, is essentially a sovereign choice, first of all on our behalf as citizens, and secondly in the climate change context for next and future generations. That, I think, is something we should remind ourselves the next time when somebody says it can't be done, it's too expensive. First of all, the arguments have actually been disproven in the last 15 years. The cost per kilowatt hour has collapsed almost in terms of its original cost. In the last few years, the international global economy has invested more in renewable energy technology infrastructure for electricity production than for oil, gas and coal and nuclear combined. So this is an energy revolution that has begun. India's future energy matrix surely will be more oriented by the prospect of where we will be in 30 years' time than by where we are today or where cheap energy helped us to come from. And that is to say, there is no simple answer to this, but it's a public debate that I think India has embarked on wholeheartedly. And if you look at this international solar alliance, for instance, that the Prime Minister brought to Paris at the time, just yesterday it has reached its critical mass, and it will be interesting to see, because why did India feel confident to go to Paris with that alliance? Because it saw in its own domestic economy how quickly...
Some astrologer told government of India that Trump was going to win.
And, you know,
and in Paris agreement won.
I was in Bonn at the climate conference just a few weeks ago. Like, in the end, and eventually, America's part in the global climate response is absolutely vital. But what you first of all saw in Bonn is that America was there, the America of the states, the America of business, of communities, and they actually are committed to implementing the Paris Agreement. So be it. I mean, Kyoto, you know, that many consider a failure today, the Kyoto Protocol was the godfather of the Paris Agreement.
Yes.
And, you know, we learn, and I think the world, I wish the world would sometimes give also the United Nations a little bit of credit for being this patient learning platform on which nations with so divergent interests actually in the end are able to come together. We saw it with Agenda 2030, we saw it with the Paris Agreement. People are saying multilateralism doesn't work.
Will you give the same lecture to President Trump also?
Well, believe it or not, I am in Washington from time to time, and you know, as the Secretary General and I and my colleagues in the UN try and engage with the US administration, we also see that there are some statements that are painful for us, but there are others also that acknowledge that, you know, the US retains a very significant interest in the functioning.
Because he just complicated the lives of your colleagues in the Middle East by recognizing Jerusalem as
it is the privilege of elected governments to complicate lives for their citizens. Whether they should complicate lives for others is another question.
I think it's also complicated Netanyahu's life because he wasn't prepared for it.
Look, when you are in the United Nations, I can tell you almost every day, something will happen somewhere in the world where you sit back for a moment and say, why? And why now? Part of the reason why we exist is that we are almost like a safety net. We are an insurance policy for the world to be able to deal with those moments where we are likely to fall apart. People forget why the United Nations was born. It was after the catharsis of the Second World War. And this is what keeps, I'm sure, the Secretary General, myself and many others in the UN committed to working on this idea of a United Nations in a world where nations are not united. That is the reality.
Okay. Maybe President Trump will also see it in the course of time.
Things can happen.
It's better if you want the second term. God, we are all in trouble. Okay. Thank you very much.
I appreciate the time.
Such a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you.